Welcome to part 2 of our SaaS application build. And if you haven't seen it already, I recommend that you go back and check out the first video in this series to get a feel for what we're trying to do in this application. So we have already got a basic application set up, and we have a subscription model already created. And as you can see here by looking at the schema file, we have a plan column in our database. So that will contain the name of the plan, which is small, medium, or large, and even the free plan. And we also have this active until field, and this allows us to know from the database how long this subscription has before it needs to be renewed again. So before we jump too deeply into this, I want to remind you guys that if you have not already subscribed to the channel, to make sure and hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications. I do create quite a lot of Ruby on Rails type content on YouTube, and having worked in the startup space for quite some time, having built multiple startups myself, I've come to realize over time that Ruby on Rails is a perfect fit for building minimum viable products or MVPs, and that's why I like to use it quite a lot for these kind of builds. So just a quick recap on what we did in the last video. So the purpose of this build is to create a job board application. So users can subscribe to a subscription plan, and they can post jobs to hire for their startup or for their business. So when a user or a company needs to hire staff, they can use our job board to do that. So we set up this templated plans page. So this plans page that we have created is just a static page right now, but we want the user to be able to choose a plan from this page, and we will subscribe them to that plan. So we have this subscription model, which is very empty right now, but it does belong to the account model. So each subscription will belong to a user account. And we have created this subscription controller, and we're just going to add some features in here now to allow us to choose a plan. So we'll create a new action for this. We'll call that update. And in fact, we can probably rename that to be something more suitable, like choose plan, just to be very concise and clear on what we are trying to do with this code that we're about to write. You'll notice here that I'm not using the standard boilerplate code that comes with a controller in Ruby on Rails. So I started from scratch this time, and the reason for that is we are wanting to automatically create the subscription in the database once the account is set up. So once a user creates an account, we will automatically create a subscription. So the main thing we want to do here in the subscriptions controller is to allow the user to select a plan. So once they select that plan, it will update it in the database. So the first thing we'll do here is to try to find this subscription that has been recorded in the database, and we'll do that using the account ID. So current account is a device helper in this case. So if we had called our device model, if we had called it user, then it would be current_user to get that logged in user. So in this case, we have an account model. So now we will want to check and see if that subscription is present, if it can be found in the database. So we'll say if subscription.present, and we'll also then check to see if that subscription can be updated. So we'll try to update this subscription with the new plan. So that plan is passed in as a param. So a parameter gets passed in with the name of that plan. So we're simply updating one column here. And then if that is successful, we will run some additional code. And then otherwise, we will catch those scenarios where the subscription wasn't found or it couldn't be updated for some reason. So now I will go back to the account model, and in here I want to add a method that gets called after the account has been created. So that will only be called once when the account is created for the first time. So the method we will call setUpSubscription. And this will be a private method, so we don't want this to be accessible via the browser. So this will only be called within this model. So in here, we want to create a new subscription for this user. So we'll say subscription.create, and we'll pass in the account ID, and that will be self.id in this case. So self referring to the account that we we have just created. And we will also pass in a default free plan, so the user will automatically have that free plan once the account is created for the first time. And we can also set a default value for the active until column. So in this case, I will just set it for 1 month in the future from now. So now that we know that this subscription is created automatically for the current user that is signed in, we can modify our subscriptions controller code a little bit here. So rather than trying to find this by account ID, we can simply call current account.subscription because we already have that relationship created in the account model. So we say in the account model it has one subscription is the relationship. So now that we know we have the subscription and the plan can be saved with the new plan that we have selected, we will want to call some code to set up a subscription using Stripe. So let's add the code now for that. So once again here I'm going to use the current account, and this time we will create a new method that can be called directly on this account. So we'll call it setup Stripe subscription. And the name of this method is very self-explanatory. We're using the Stripe gem to create a subscription for this account. So we'll create this method now. So in the previous video, we have already added the Stripe gem to our gem file and installed that. So this time we should be able to just interact directly with the Stripe gem. And most of this subscription content is based loosely around memory from doing this previously in different applications. So there may be some things I don't get right first time, but we'll try to work through them as best as we can. So in this case, we're simply calling the customer.create, and this can actually be found within the Stripe documentation. So we can use the API to simply create customers when we need to create them from our own app logic. So in this case, after an account is created on our Rails app, we will call this method and we will set up the customer within the Stripe platform. I'm just going back to the schema file to see what data we're recording here. So far we have the accounts table and the subscriptions table. And I think what we can add here is the Stripe account ID. So once we have a Stripe account created, we do want to record that in our local database. So we can use that customer ID that is created by Stripe to call the API to carry out any actions we need on the Stripe platform. So let's add that field to our table first. So now within this migration, we will add an additional column. So that is a subscriptions table. And we will name this column Stripe customer ID. And this will be a string. So let's run the Rails TP migrate to update the database. So let's add some comments to this method just to describe what we're trying to achieve here. So first of all, we'll need to find the subscription from the database. And then if the subscription is not found, or we don't have a customer Stripe ID at this point, then we will try to create a new customer on the Stripe platform. So we can do that using the API call. Sometimes I like to write out comments in this way. It just helps me break down the logic of what we're trying to achieve, and then we can add code for each step. So first we want to select the subscription. So this subscription belongs directly to the account, but we should assign this to a local variable, and then we can detect if it exists, and we can use that then to select the customer ID. So let's say plan. So let's create a new variable called plan, and we'll say subscription, and then we can say if plan.stripe customer ID .present, and in fact we can say unless plan.customer stripe ID is present, then we will run this code. So we only want to run this code if the Stripe customer ID is not found. So the use case for this really is if the account has been created but they haven't selected the plan yet, then that would be the scenario where the Stripe customer ID hasn't been set. So when they first sign up, we're simply creating the record in our local database or our server database. But once they select the plan, at that point, then we are creating the Stripe subscription. So that means that if someone signs up but they never get past the sign up page, they will not actually have a Stripe subscription active. So they must choose that at the first page we take them to, which is the select plan page. So for the Stripe API call, we want to pass in some parameters. So we'll create a new variable called Stripe params for this. And I'm going to list out some of the values that we're going to pass in. So we will have a description, a plan, an email, and we will have a source of payment. So that would be the card that the user has added when they are clicking on the subscribe button. So now let's create this Stripe params variable, and this will be a hash that contains these values. So we'll create that using the curly bracket syntax, and we will then assign a value. So these names on the left of this hash, these are the symbols, and then we will assign a value for each of these symbols. So the description would maybe be like what the user name is or what their email is, something like that, so we can reference them within the Stripe platform. And obviously our plan is what the subscription that the user has selected, and then we have the email, which is part of our user account or our account model, and then finally the source would be the card that is being used for the payment. So first of all, let's populate the description. So this is just simply for us to recognize the subscription when we are browsing within Stripe. So our plan name we want to pass in here. So if we check within Stripe, we can see that we've got this premium monthly plan, and aside from the name premium, I don't think we really have to reference it in any other way. So this is dictated by the number or the quantity that we pass in. So the pricing tier is based on the quantity of, in this case, how many job posts they want to create each month. So let's call the plan premium. And the email will be, in this case, we are using the account model. So this method is within the account model. So we'll say self.email. And the source will be our payment method. And for the source, we can pass that into this method when we are calling it from our controller. So we will just reference that directly. So aside from that, these are the key things that we need here right now. So we're setting them in this hash, which gets passed into the API call. So the other thing we haven't set yet is the quantity. So let's create a new variable for this, and we will say, we'll use a case statement for this. So we'll pass in the plan, and when the plan has a name of small, then we will set a quantity. I think it's 3. I think it is 3 jobs for the small plan. We can check this on the website. So in the medium plan, we have, so small is 3 and the medium is 9 jobs. And then the large one is unlimited. So when it is medium, we'll return the value of 9. And when it is large, then we can just set a value for this of 100. You could make this much larger, but yeah, so this is basically an unlimited plan. So you could make that 1000 or even higher. So then we will pass the quantity into this hash. So if we look at the customer create page on the Stripe API documentation, it will give us some example code of how we can do this, how we can create this customer account. And you'll see some of the fields that I was already populating in my code, but there are additional fields that we can set here, including metadata, phone number, shipping address, and lots of other information. We're only focusing on a very select few of these fields, and even some of these are optional, like the source here is optional. So now let's have a look at the subscriptions. So the subscriptions API call will give us some information here. So the documentation for this will give us some information about the data that we need to pass. So in this case, we are using a customer ID. So this is a Stripe customer ID. So once we create the customer in Stripe, we can record the ID and use it to subscribe that customer to whichever plan that we want to. So it says here that we can create up to 20 subscription items and pass them all at once. But in this case, we just want to pass the single Stripe plan. So the Stripe plan plus the quantity, and the quantity will be used to determine the actual price of the plan in our case. So since we are creating a new customer on Stripe, we should really pass in the name of that customer. So we'll add a new value for that. We'll add that at the top. So a new key of name. So I'm just looking for the format here in the documentation. So this is a full name all passed at once. So in this case, we'll pass a string. And that string will be referenced as full name. So we'll create a method for this full name. And that method will return both the first name and the last name as a single string. So we can embed these values within it. Self.first name. We also want the last name. So this first name and last name value is coming from our device model. So we go to the schema file, under the DB folder, you will see both of these values in the accounts table. And we can update the description here, just remove this and make it a little bit more useful to us. We can pass the customer ID, so the ID from our database, so that we can debug anything related to that customer later if we need to. Say customer, and we will use string interpolation to pass in the customer ID. Now you may have noticed here that we have this plan and quantity values. So we don't actually need these here at the moment because this Stripe params is being used to create the customer. Those additional fields will be used for the subscription, which is a different API call. So down here at the bottom, we have this account creation, but if we do have a customer ID already, then we want to fetch that Stripe customer ID using the API call. So there's an API call called customer.retrieve, and we'll simply pass in the Stripe customer ID, and that will load the account for us. And it will become a little more clear why we're doing this in a few minutes. If we have this account selected, then we will be able to use it to add additional subscriptions or modify the subscription on that account already. So in this case, if we already have an account, we're selecting it from Stripe. But if we don't have an account, then we're creating a new one. And then directly underneath, then we will handle the subscription part. So this time we're calling the Stripe API again, but we're calling the subscription.create. So previously we did the customer.create, but this time we're doing subscription.create. And we can see in the documentation that we need to pass in the customer. So in this case, we should have that stored within the plan.stripe customer ID. And then this subscription method also takes a list of items, so an array of items. In this case, we just pass in the array with the plan name. So our plan name is Premium. And I think we can just pass the quantity in directly here also. So we've already set the quantity up above based on the plan name. So on the documentation, we can see that there is the name of the plan, and then there are additional fields underneath for the price. And then underneath that, there is the quantity. So it is optional here, but since our price is based on the quantity, it's actually quite important to pass that in. And there's also an additional field here for canceling. So you can set an end to that subscription time. I think for this, we will just keep it very simple. We will just keep the plan name and the quantity. But we do also need to keep in mind that later we may need to update the subscription if the user wants to change or upgrade that plan. So in that case, we want to record the ID of that subscription. So we'll see that once we call this create method, it will return these values. And probably the most important one for us here is the ID itself. So if we can record that in the database, that means that later we can simply call that subscription, retrieve it, and then modify it as we need to. So back in our account model now, let's assign a value to this subscription.create. So we'll call that subscription, and then underneath them we can call subscription.id after that has been created. So that's how we access this value for the ID. So in order for us to use the subscription ID, we will need to record it in the database. So we do have this Stripe customer ID in our subscriptions table, but we don't have a field for the actual subscription ID itself. So let's add this now. We'll add a new field to this table. So we'll open the migration, and in here we'll simply say add column, and that's on the subscriptions table. And the new field name will be Stripe subscription ID. And that will be a string. So now let's run Rails DB migrate. And this will add the new column to our table. So in the schema file, now we can see we have an additional column for the subscription ID. So we go back to the model now in our account model. So now we can save this subscription ID. So we'll say self.update and the Stripe subscription ID, and that should close out this method. And I will quickly add a comment here. So we'll say update subscription and database. And the reason I'm adding the comment here is really just because we're dealing with subscriptions in the cloud, which is in Stripe, and we're also recording the subscriptions in our local database. So it can get very confusing quite easily. So sometimes it's good to just comment to let anyone else reading the code know quite easily what's going on here. So I do like to comment out code where things are a little bit more complicated than normal. So in this case, we have a subscription that is being updated with the new plan and quantity. And then finally, we store that subscription ID in the database. So you may already have noticed at this point that we don't have any criteria in place to detect if a subscription is already created on Stripe. So we'll do that now. So in the case where a customer has already been created and they already have a subscription, then we would want to retrieve that subscription and modify it. So if we look here at the API documentation for the customer, when we select the customer, they will have some data about the subscriptions already attached to that customer record. So in this case, if a subscription is found on that customer, we can simply detect it from the customer itself rather than making an additional API call for that. So we'll see here that the data is an array. So since it's an array, we can use array methods on it. So in this case, we'll say count.subscriptions.data, and we can use a .size method to detect if there's any entries in that array. So we'll say if it's greater than 0, then we will select the subscription, but then otherwise we will create a new subscription. And actually, I think there might be an easier way to do this. So we're loading the subscription here, but we can see here at the bottom we've got self to update, subscription ID. Okay, so the subscription, I think we don't actually need this part. So bear with me here a moment. We can keep the create method for the subscription. So we can see here at the bottom we've got self to update, but this is actually the subscription ID, which should be attached to the subscription record on our database. So currently we're in the account model, so this doesn't quite make sense right here, but we can fix this up and improve on this. So what we want here is to firstly update this at the bottom. So this should be the plan we're updating. So at the moment we've got this self to update, which isn't quite right because this is the account model. So we scroll up here to the top, we can see that we have this plan equals subscription. So the subscription belongs to the account. So we should be saying plan.update and then saving the subscription ID. So we can use the plan to determine if that subscription ID is already set or not. So let's update this code to make it a little bit more efficient. So we'll say if plan.subscriptionID.present, and then if it's not present, then we'll run this creation code. So if it's present, then we would want to load that subscription. So in this case, then we would say subscription.retrieve. So this is our API call to select the subscription based on the ID that we store for it. So we can see here on the retrieve a subscription, we simply need to pass in the ID. So we'll pass in plan.stripe subscription ID. And at this point, we will want to update the subscription. So we've already retrieved it, so now we want to call the update method on it. I'm just looking at the documentation here. So in order to update, we want to pass in the ID, and then we'll want to pass in the values that we want to set. So in this case, an array of items. So an array of hashes it describes as. So the question is here, do we actually need to retrieve the subscription, or can we just update it directly? So perhaps we can modify this. So let's change this to update, and then we'll also need to pass in the values. that we want to be updating. So our items array, and then the entries that we want to include. So we can just copy and paste this plan and quantity. I will simply replace that. So I think that's basically the method complete. We have written a lot of code here based around the subscriptions, and it has been a little bit more complex than most of our code in this application so far. So hopefully you guys have been able to stick with me for that. And looking back now at the plan page that the user gets directed to once they sign in, we want to be able to choose a plan here and then call this method to create that subscription. So we'll be calling that code we've spent the last 15 or 20 minutes writing. So we need to have a form embedded within this page. So we'll begin here by creating the form tag helper. We'll pass in a new route. So let's make this into a block of code. And we'll add the end tag to close off the form. So within this form, we will have a hidden field. And that hidden field will store the name of the plan. So in this case, it will be either the free plan or small, medium, or large. That will be the values. And then in the back end, then we determine what the quantity is based on the value that's passed. So if it's a small plan, then we set the quantity to 3 posts per month. If it's a medium, we set it to 9. And the large one then is unlimited. So let's create this route for the plan select. So our form will be using the post method, and we'll be posting that data to plan/subscribe URL. And we'll add a method for this in the subscriptions controller. So we already have this method in place. It's called choosePlan. So we're just pointing it to that method. And then we can assign a name to this route. So we'll call that choosePlan. So now we have this choosePlan path route already in place. So on the front end, I'm going to have a look and see if we can see this form that we have added. So we can see that we've got the plan/subscribe, it's a post method, and we've got the authenticity token that's added by default by Rails. And we've got this plan underneath, but the value doesn't look correct here. So let's have a look at this and see if we can fix it. So I think we need to remove this value and just pass it automatically. Yeah, that's looking better now. So there are a couple of ways we can approach this. We could have 4 separate forms on this page, 1 in each column, just like this, with static values. But the alternative way is to just create one form on this page for choosing the plan, and then we would modify the value of this hidden field before we submit the data. I'm going to take the second approach, which is a little bit cleaner, a little bit less markup in our view. So we'll simply have one form, but we will attach an ID to that form so we can reference it within our JavaScript. And we can give it a ID value of subscribe to plan. So we'll be using this to select the form. And we want to trigger that once any of these buttons are clicked. So we have the button to say sign up for this plan, and we'll attach a data ID, or actually we can use a data plan value. So this will be used in our JavaScript to set the value in the form. So this will be updated for each of these buttons. So this is just a attribute on the element, on the button element, but we're using the data attribute because We only want to be using that internally. We're not using it to style the element or do anything. It's just to store information that we can access within JavaScript. And I've gone back to the Stripe documentation again, and this time I'm looking at the checkout, so the API for the checkout. So what it does is, and as you can see here, we've got the gem already installed, so it's the Stripe gem. But the checkout allows us to capture card details from the customer on the front end, and then we can process payments in the back end. So I'm going to investigate the documentation a little bit more, and then in the next video we will be implementing the front end to capture the user card details and begin the process of recurring billing. So I'm going to wrap this up here for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this content, make sure to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos on Ruby on Rails and building a SaaS application. And I will see you guys in the next video.